Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Arthritis Talks, Move More, Hurt Less, Winter Strategies for Staying Active with Arthritis. I'm Dr. Sean Bevan, Chief Science Officer at Arthritis Society Canada. We've come together for this event from many different places, but I would first like to acknowledge the land on which I am on and which our Toronto office stands, which is the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee Indigenous peoples. Today, this place is meeting place to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and I am so grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. Now, we know that physical activity is one of the best forms of treatment for people living with arthritis, but being active when you have arthritis can be really challenging, especially during cold winter months. Tonight, we are joined by Trevor Donald, a physiotherapist from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and Claire Jacek, an occupational therapist from our program in Guelph, Ontario. Trevor and Claire will share their insights and wealth of experience to help you manage your arthritis. But first, just a few logistics. This webinar is best viewed on a laptop or desktop computer. If you have any technical difficulties, please email arthritistalks@arthritis.ca for assistance. If you have a question for one of our presenters, you can submit it through the Q&A button at the bottom middle of the screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible during the hour that we have here together. You can click on the chat icon also in the bottom middle of the screen to access the chat and connect to other participants and our chat moderator. If you'd like to close out of that chat completely, just click the X icon. And to enable closed captioning, please click on the Show Captioning icon in your controls toolbar at the bottom of the screen. So many questions we received in advance followed similar themes, so we'll get to those first before going to a live Q&A at the end of the session. And before we get started, I want to thank our event partners, including Pfizer and others, for their financial support of our Arthritis Talk series. Now with that, let's get started, and a warm welcome to today's experts, Trevor and Claire. Trevor, I think I'll start with you. Could you start us off tonight by going back to the basics and really explaining the difference between physical activity and exercise?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I'm very happy to be here. This is the second one I've done for the Arthritis Society, and really looking forward to doing this one tonight. And should be a fun night. So, when we look at physical activity versus exercise, quite often people will use the terms interchangeably. However, we know that they are different, and I think it is important that we know the difference between the two before we can properly give recommendations as to what we do with one versus the other one. So when we look at physical activity, we're talking about essentially any kind of movement that is carried out by muscles. And generally, when muscles do produce any movement, they require energy to do that. And so physical activity, we'll go through some examples in the next slide, but essentially any movement that requires energy versus exercise has a lot more structure to it. So exercise is something that we plan. Exercise is repetitive, and it has a specific intention to it, usually to improve fitness. And there's different aspects of fitness: strength, flexibility, balance, cardiovascular fitness. And so exercise really is just a type of physical activity. So if we were to look at some of the different examples of, what is physical activity versus what is exercise. So physical activity can be something as simple as, say, going for a walk outside. Maybe we use the stairs instead of the elevator, doing some gardening, dancing, something like that, whether we're dancing with somebody else or we're just dancing on our own at home. Any of those can be considered physical activity and definitely count towards how much we move. Versus exercise, like I said, is a little bit more structured. And so there'd be aerobic exercise, which is the type of exercise where it gets us breathing hard and gets our heart rate up. Strengthening exercise or resistive exercise, where the purpose is to actually get ourselves stronger, to build our endurance. There's different types of mobility exercise or stretching, where we're trying to improve how well and how much we can move. And then the one we often forget about is balance exercise, where we know we can train our balance. and because there's a lot of different aspects that go into balance. And so doing some of these specific things for balance can be very, very important as well.
That's great. So Claire, could you elaborate a little bit on why is exercise so important for people with arthritis?
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Sean, for bringing up this great topic on, especially on in times like this, being in winter in the cold days of January, is and especially at the new year, we often think about making behavior changes, and often people have resolutions around increasing their physical activity or their exercise in their day to day. And we know when we're making behavior changes, so changes to what we do in our day to day, that it can be really helpful to think about why we want to make that change. And so let me present you with some of the key benefits for why exercise can be so beneficial for people with arthritis. Let's start off with pain, which lots of people with arthritis experience. We know that exercise can be quite beneficial for pain relief, and there have been some studies that have shown that exercise can be as good, if not better, than things like anti-inflammatories or Tylenol for pain relief. We know exercise can help people to sleep better, which can improve their fatigue or as well improve their pain. Exercise can also help people to have a brighter mood. It's an evidence-based treatment for depression and can help with people's self-esteem. Strength and stronger muscles is something we really think about with arthritis. And we know as we get older, our muscle mass decreases. And at any age, we can regain some muscle mass, and those stronger muscles help to keep our joints healthy and help to reduce the risk of osteoarthritis progression. Exercise can also help people to be more stable. So we know that exercise is the single most effective falls prevention intervention, uh, including exercises that have a strengthening and a balance component. And this improved balance and stability can help with our overall level of function. And exercise can help us to be able to do the things that we want to do and the things that we need to do in our day to day a lot easier. So take a moment to reflect on what your main reason for staying active is. If you want to, you can just share that in the chat. Um, because knowing this motivation, knowing this reason for staying active can help when things start to get challenging. For example, some challenges that come up with the winter.
Thanks so much, Claire. And I'm already seeing people add some comments there about why they'd like to stay active, which is amazing to see. Trevor, moving back to you, what about quantity? How much physical activity is recommended for people living with arthritis?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. This is a great question. This is a question that we get very commonly. How much should I be doing? How much of each type of exercise should I be doing? And the nice thing is there is some recommended guidelines out there. So the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiologists, they put out guidelines called the 24-hour movement guidelines, and they actually break it down into different age groups. So the ones I'm going to speak of today are more for 65 years old and over. However, the 18 to 65 age group is actually very similar. It just doesn't include as much of the balance stuff. So these are some great guidelines. Is how much should we actually be moving? And again, these are based on physical activity, not just exercise. So if we're walking up the stairs in a building, that counts to these numbers instead of going to the gym or doing specific strength exercises. That we want to remember that any of this physical activity we're doing during the day counts, and I think that's important to remember. So the general goal is that we want to shoot for up to about 150 minutes per week of what's called moderate to vigorous physical activity. So usually the first question comes out of that is, what the heck is moderate to vigorous? How do I know if I'm doing that? Because not everybody's going to have a heart rate monitor on or all these special tests. So usually what I'll recommend to people, one of the easiest ways you can tell whether you're doing moderate activity or vigorous activity is something called the talk test. And so the idea of it is that if I'm doing some type of physical activity and I know I'm working hard, but I can still talk to a person next to me, then I'm doing moderate level activity. So it's enough that I know I'm working, but I can still talk to the person next to me. If I have that person next to me and I think I could talk to them, but I can't sing to them, now I'm doing vigorous activity, because singing takes that extra bit of breath, that extra bit of exertion. So if I'm working hard enough that I can't sing to them, then I'm at that vigorous level of activity. So if I can talk and sing, I'm probably at that moderate level. If I can't sing, then I'm more at the vigorous level. So kind of a really easy, quick test to tell how hard you're working. If you ever want to test it, just walk fast up a flight of stairs and then try to talk or try to sing, and it'll give you a pretty good idea, of what your breath is like, and it'll give you an idea of whether you're at that moderate or vigorous. With that, the recommendations are we want to probably at least a couple times a week do some sort of muscle strengthening. Again, doesn't have to be in a gym, doesn't have to be with weights. There's particular types of body weight exercises, different things like yoga, Pilates, those sorts of things can involve strengthening activities. So we want to do some sort of specific strengthening activities, at least a couple times a week. We want to do something that challenges balance, particularly with some of the different arthritic conditions. We know balance can get really affected through the hips, the knees, feet, ankles. So there's static balance training where we're kind of standing still, and then there's more dynamic balance training where we're actually moving. So we might be sidestepping, we might be turning, we might be walking. And so the dynamic balance is arguably more important than the static balance, because if we're going to lose our balance or fall, it's usually not from standing still. It's usually while we're actually doing some sort of movement. So that dynamic balance is quite important. And then, more from the cardiovascular aspect, we want to do some sort of light physical activity. This includes standing. We know that we burn energy and burn calories just being on our feet. So, even being on our feet, doing some things around the house, walking around the grocery store, walking from our car into a store, all those sorts of things count as that light physical activity where we can just be up and moving around and getting some sort of compression through our joints. So then with that, again, another one of the questions we'll often get is, it hurts when I do activity, which again, very common with many types of arthritis. And so what we try to do is we try to put a number on that, is to help give people a guideline of, okay, how much is too much, or when are we actually starting to risk our tissues or our body. So if we use a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is no pain, 10 is, as bad as it possibly could be, get me to the hospital right now kind of pain, then we look at where are we on that range of 0 to 10. So if I'm somewhere in that 0 to 2 range, I'm quite safe. I might have a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of stiffness, but generally I'm fine. I can continue on without too much issue. If that pain starts to get into that 2 to 5 out of 10 range, now it's a little bit of a yellow light for us, where we start to recognize, okay, our body's trying to tell us something. Pain is our body's warning system. So it's still safe to continue. We just got to be a little mindful of that pain and being a little more careful with how we're doing things. Once we get past that 5 out of 10, now our body's really telling us, I don't like this. And we likely need to modify what we're doing, or in some cases even stop. Generally, the preferred notion is to modify. So we might do it slower, we might do less, we might do less intense, less repetition, that sort of idea. Or we start to change the activity we're doing. Instead of going for a walk, maybe we ride the stationary bike, or we go for a swim, just some sort of modification. So the whole idea of it is recognize, especially with these arthritic conditions, some pain is normal. It's okay to have some pain. We just got to make sure we're within that safe range.
I'm really glad you just covered that, Trevor, because that's probably the most frequent question that we get asked. How do you know when it's too much, when the pain is too much? I'm wondering now, could you go into some of the activities that people can think about to remain physically active, especially at this time of year? Many of us are joining from colder climates and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I live in Saskatchewan, where it's cold for 8 months of the year, generally. So it's certainly a consideration that we still want to move, but we want to be comfortable while we're doing it. We want it to be enjoyable. And so that's kind of my number one point is no matter what type of activity we're doing, and again, it could be exercise, but it could be another activity, is we're much more likely to enjoy it and we're much more likely to actually do it if it's fun and or if it has a social component to it. So I usually recommend to people, really look for activities that have, at least one, if not both of those aspects to it. And then it won't seem like a chore, that it's, we can do the activity, it's going to be good for us, but we can also get a good visit out of it, have some fun, and the time will go by a lot quicker in most cases. And so some examples, for the winter time especially, indoor walking. So a lot of the different towns and cities now have indoor walking tracks or shopping malls. If somebody lives in a condo building or a senior's residence, even just walking through the halls, we can still get a good walk in just a nice dry, non-icy, warm environment. So indoor walking is a nice option. Of course, there is all the different sports. I believe pickleball is now the number one sport in Canada. Very, very popular, and more and more facilities available for things like pickleball. Bowling, so that this can be at a bowling alley, or if anybody remembers the Nintendo Wii and some of the different video game systems that are out there, you can bowl on them. I have a seniors complex that I go to every month to do a presentation, and every time I get there, they're bowling. They have the Wii hooked up and they're bowling every time I get there, so it's fun to see. And then also becoming more and more common are these golf simulators as well, where you can actually do some golfing indoors in the winter time, and they're kind of a nice way because you can pick how long you go for, how intense you do it, and you don't have to do the walking 6,000 yards at a time while you're doing it as well. So there's some of the sporting ones. Lots of different options as far as body weight exercises, and so these can be really nice ways to strengthen things like a chair squat. And so it's literally just sitting down, standing up out of a chair. It can be a nice strength exercise. One of the more common ones I give the people I see is countertop push-ups. So they do a push-up off the edge of their countertop. If that's too difficult or is painful for the hands and wrists, we can do it off a wall. So, just sort of pushing yourself up and down off of a wall. Same idea, we can get some strengthening, but it certainly not as much work and as much load as, say, a regular push-up on the floor. And then even things like marching on the spot, just these different things where we use our body weight to our advantage to move. Another option, again, if it's available, is water exercise. So, the aquasize, there's lots of arthritis pool programs in some of the different facilities. Even within your bathtub, doing some ankle exercises, knee exercises, moving your legs back and forth in the bathtub against the resistance of the water. The warmth of the water is always nice for those joints, and it can create a little bit of resistance because the faster you try to move, the more resistance the water is going to give you. So water exercise is a really good option. Of course, we've got all the online digital stuff available to us these days, YouTube probably being the most common. I've just put a little bit of a cautionary note on there. Be careful who and what you're watching and sort of what their background is, because there's a lot of good stuff on YouTube, but there's also a lot of not so good stuff. So we want to be a little bit careful with who we're watching and what type of activities we do try. We want to make sure it's coming from a reputable source. And then failing that, I always encourage people to get creative. Something my kids and I developed during the COVID lockdown was something we called the Sock Olympics. So we started all these games and events at home that we did with socks. So we just had socks rolled up in a ball, and we did a bucket toss. So we had 4 different size of buckets. You got more points if you got the socks into the smaller buckets. We also did bowling. So we set up my son's minifigures or action figures on the floor, and we bowled them over with the socks. And so, getting really creative with those sorts of things at home, where we can do these things like bowling or some of these different activities, even within the comfort of our own home. Because again, it doesn't have to be hard; it just needs to be active. And so we just want to encourage that movement in any way we can.
Thanks, Trevor. Lots of good ideas. I admit I did do the sock bucket toss with my kids during the pandemic lockdown as well, so we have that in common. Claire, could you speak a little bit to how people can adapt their exercise routine to safely stay active in the winter?
Absolutely. And Now, so we've established that we need to stay active all year round to keep our joints healthy, to keep our muscles strong, and it can help reduce that risk of falls, which keeps us safe. But we know here in Canada that winter weather can often disrupt our best laid exercise plans, and it can do so in a couple of different ways. We know those icy or slippery surfaces might increase our fear of falling or injuring ourselves. We also know that some people with arthritis feel they have worsened pain when it's particularly cold or if there's some snow around. And there are many theories as to why that might be. I know that with respect to cold, there's the theory that um, the fluid that's in our joint capsule becomes thicker in the colder weather, and that might make us feel more stiff as we try to move through our joints. Some people also notice worsened pain in those particularly humid type of climates or changes in barometric pressure because that can change the tension through our muscles or our tendons and can contribute to pain. But we know that this isn't universally true, and even the research that looks at the impact of weather on people with arthritis can have some contradictions within it. And really, the main point is we can't go about and change our weather, and so we might need to actually modify our activity that we do. And this is where joint protection principles can be really beneficial to give us a framework for how we might go about modifying our activities in our day to day, in this case, exercise, to help reduce some strain on our joints, reduce pain, and make activities a bit easier for us to do to reduce the risk of injuring ourselves. So the key principles are changing the method. So that might be looking at different ways to still do the same activity. Maybe that's doing something sitting down rather than standing up, or using bigger joints of our body to carry some weight. We think about pacing ourselves during an activity. That could be looking at breaking a larger activity into smaller bits or smaller amounts of time. Assistive devices can help us to more easily perform a painful or difficult activity. And in the same way, braces can be beneficial as well to lessen the strain on a painful joint and help to maintain proper alignment. So if we take these principles and now try to apply it to our exercise routine in the winter, let's start with changing the method. Uh, so Trevor has already highlighted some really great ideas for how to stay active inside the home. I wanted to highlight a couple of safety considerations if you are planning to exercise at home. And really, what we want to do is make sure that the environment that we're exercising in or being physically active in is safe. And so, some things to look around your environment and look for are making sure that your living space is free of obstacles and clutter to reduce the risks of trips and falls. You want your environment to be brightly lit so that you can see where you need to go. You want sturdy railings on your stairs. You can use them if you need to, but even if you don't, it's a good idea to hover your hand over the railing as you're going up and down so that it's there for you if you need to hold on. We'd also look around our environment and remove any loose area rugs, secure them in place with non-slip grip or rug tape to reduce the risk of tripping on this furniture. Some of the exercises that we might look at can be seated. So if we are exercising in a chair, we'd be looking for something that's sturdy, that doesn't have wheels on it, and something that you might consider pushing up against a solid object like a wall or a more solid piece of furniture so it doesn't slide around on you. Now, shoes can also help to make our exercise routine safer and as well as reducing some strain on our feet, our knees, and our hips. There are some features of what to look for in a supportive shoe, and I've pulled one out here just to show that if you're looking at your shoe, you want it to have a sturdy bottom sole, so you shouldn't be able to fold it in half. You'd be looking for a nice solid heel counter, so you shouldn't be able to compress the back part of your heel. And you'd be looking to have the toe box give you an appropriate height or width for your toes in case there's been any changes to how your feet are shaped. Um, Beyond some of these safety considerations, we look at ways to add a bit more movement into your daily life. Some of these ideas came to me from clients over the years that I want to pass along to you. One client was telling me that as she would finish up her meals, she'd take a few moments to bend and straighten her knees and get her hips moving, and then she'd sit and stand from her chair 3 times before she got up from the table to work on a bit of leg strengthening. Um, if you are standing those 2 times a day to brush your teeth, that could be another opportunity to add in some movement. So you might hold on to the counter so it's nice and stable and consider rising up onto your toes to work a little bit of leg strengthening. Similarly, we might be waiting in the kitchen for a bit while the kettle boils or while the coffee percolates. And we can take that as an opportunity to challenge our balance. Really, we might look at minimizing our base of support. So you might consider standing with your feet together, or if you're really feeling interesting, you can put the heel in line with the toe to reduce that base of support and challenge your balance while you can hold onto the kitchen counter. I even had one client tell me that as he would walk through doors around his house, he'd tap the top of the door frame to work on a bit of shoulder range of motion and upper back stretch. So you can get quite creative, like what Trevor was talking about earlier. Um, when we start to apply pacing to our exercise routines, the first thing I want to think about is taking regular breaks. I, and this comes to this idea that motion is lotion, moving is helpful for our joints. And so, even on those days where we might feel particularly painful or stiff, we do want to have some movement. And so, you might choose lower intensity exercises or reduce the number of repetitions for your exercise program on those days. You might also look at breaking up an activity into smaller chunks. So if you regularly go for a 30-minute walk, you could consider breaking that into 3 10-minute walks, or even smaller than that, and then gradually increasing the amount of time that you're walking. The other meaning to taking regular breaks comes to the fact that in winter, we might be sitting a lot more than we are at other times in the year. And so, just like how we might take a break from regular activity, we also need to take a break from sitting to do something standing up. So, use your phone, use your smartwatch, or some other form of alerting yourself that every 20 to 30 minutes we should be changing our body position. The second point here is around warming up. And warming up also has two meanings. We know people might feel more stiff in those cold winter weather. And this is, I like to use the analogy of a car on a cold winter's day. Is you might need to run your car for a few minutes before you take it out onto the road. Similarly, we might need to warm up our joints, get our muscles going, and get our circulation flowing before we start exercise. So move before you move. That might include some gentle range of motion exercises or stretches to get your body moving before you start your exercise plan. The second meaning of warm up is quite literally keep yourself warm. Dress appropriately for the weather, wear multiple layers, and you can even consider heated clothing. So they make heated vests, they make heated gloves, heated socks, which can be a great way to increase some heat to those painful joint areas and make it more comfortable for you to exercise outside.
Thanks so much, Claire. Um, what about assistive devices? Are there any that you'd recommend to help people stay active?
Absolutely. And there are so many different assistive devices out there. And really, it comes down to what part of the body are we trying to support and what kind of activity might we be trying to do. So on the screen here, we have a couple of the assistive devices that I like to think about when our hands are bothering us. So when our hands are bothering us, it might be particularly difficult to grasp things tightly, which can be a challenge if we're trying to hold on to things like dumbbells. And so some adaptations we might make is we might use a weighted cuff or even something like an ankle weight and put that around our wrist so that it reduces the gripping demands as we go to do some exercises for our arms. Similarly, we can see the photo in the middle is a dumbbell that actually has an integrated strap with it. So you can slide your hand through the loop and it reduces the amount you need to squeeze to hold on to that dumbbell. Um, and on the right-hand side, we can see some resistance bands. Resistance bands are great low-cost options for strengthening, but some people might have difficulty grasping on to their resistance band. So looping it around the hand like I've shown there, or even tying a loop in it and putting it around the wrist can be a great way to avoid needing to grasp onto the band with the hand. If you are noticing more pain in the lower half of you, um, some of my favorite tools, the first one I think about are walking poles. Walking poles are great for so many different reasons. They help us to stand up tall. They give us a bit more balance and stability when we're out walking. And because we're taking up some of that weight and pressure into our arms, it reduces the amount of strain through our feet, our knees, our hips, and our lower back. So it can be helpful if those areas are bothering us. Walking poles do take a bit of practice, and there is a technique with using walking poles. The QR code on the screen there brings you to an Arthritis Society Canada blog post that goes through how to set up walking poles to the right height and the technique to using it. But I'd highly recommend people to check out to see if there are any walking pole groups in their community. Not only, like Trevor, does this add a nice social aspect to your walking, but it can help you to learn that right technique. I will make an additional note to say that walking poles don't replace a cane or a walker if that's been something that's been advised for you to use as well. Chairs and stools can be a great way to offload pressure through our hips, knees, and lower back when we're doing exercise as well. As Trevor mentioned, there are lots of great YouTube videos online that show some chair exercises, and I know chair yoga gets a lot of attention. The Arthritis Society Canada has a full series on their YouTube page about yoga for people with arthritis, including a fully seated yoga practice. And that's a great place to start off if you are considering that. Footwear also makes a big difference if we're exercising outside. So a good supported boot isn't something to overlook. So you want a nice, well-fitted boot with good traction. They do make boots that have zippers on them if you're noticing that tying up the laces is particularly challenging. And if you're having a hard time fitting into boots, you might even consider a hiking shoe that has a waterproof type material to it. That might work for you in certain days out in the winter. If you're looking to add some traction to your existing boots or your existing shoes, you could add cleats or crampons to your boots or shoes. These can add great traction on things like ice or packed snow, but there is a word of caution here. They can make it slippery if you are walking indoors or even on areas of sidewalk that might not have snow on them. So take heed if you are going out for a walk and plan to stop in for groceries after. You might want to think twice about putting those crampons on. Beyond some of these tools, we also think about assistive devices being braces. And braces can help to support a painful or damaged joint to offload some pressure there. And there are many, many braces that we could choose. And just like devices, it depends on the part of the body. I like to think about braces like little suits of armor for our joints, is you put it on and wear it when you are doing something painful and you take it off when you don't need it. And so I've put a couple up on the slide here. On the left-hand side, we can see quite a low profile brace that's supporting the base joint of the thumb. This might be a great brace if that joint is bothering you. And it's nice being low profile because it could fit underneath a pair of winter mitts or winter gloves if you're doing exercise outside. The middle brace is a more restrictive brace. It is a brace for the wrist and the thumb. It can be a great option if you're doing higher strain type activities. I think about snow shoveling being something where you're taking some more force through the hands. And on the left-hand side, we see, or on the right-hand side, rather, we see a knee brace. And there are many knee braces out there that range from simple sleeves like a tensor band or some more involved custom braces that have hinges involved in them. I usually recommend people start off with a simple sleeve to see if that provides them that bit of awareness and confidence in their joint. And that can be something that's sufficient for people. But with all braces, it is a really individualized decision. And so I recommend people to connect with a trusted healthcare professional to make sure that they're getting the brace that's right for them.
Thanks so much, Claire. Now, before we get into the Q&A, I always like to ask our presenters what excites them about the future for people living with arthritis. So Claire, maybe I'll start with you and then go to Trevor with the same question.
Absolutely. So I think there's a lot to be excited about when thinking of the future of people with arthritis. And it's this good timing because we've just pulled out the Arthritis Society's top research advances of 2024. And so one thing that really gets me excited is thinking about the potential of disease modifying medications for people with osteoarthritis. So currently the medications we have for osteoarthritis are focused on symptom management, usually pain management. But there's been a lot of work trying to identify different targets for medications that might actually alter the progression of the disease. And so that's quite exciting to think about in the future. Even while we're waiting for that, though, I think about how exciting it is that we have some evidence to suggest that those lifestyle changes in our day-to-day can make a difference on our osteoarthritis and the progression. So even good practice like this regular exercise and weight management shouldn't be forgotten when we do have a medication that comes out and even while we wait for that to come along.
What about you, Trevor? What do you think?
I think what I've noticed the most over the last few years is we know the importance of education. Um, there's statistics and research to back up that, learning more about arthritis can actually help improve the management of your arthritis. And so, not only is there more and more education becoming available, but I'm seeing a real trend where people are taking up that education. You just look at the number of people that are on this webinar right now, that it's, to me, it just seems like every year there's more and more people that are seeking out that education, whether it's through webinars, whether it's through the Arthritis Society resources, or some of the other things that are out there. So to me, that's what exciting is, not only is there more education coming out, but people are also utilizing it and seeking it out more and more than they ever used to. And then as Claire touched on, just the research that's being done. There's some really, really cool research being done out there. I know an article I came across here recently, actually from the University of Saskatchewan here, is that they're working on actually being able to detect arthritis, or osteoarthritis in particular, sort of before the joint starts to degenerate a bit. And so they're working on some markers where they can predict when and how much that degeneration is actually going to happen, so we can kind of get ahead of it before it really starts. And then when you combine that to what Claire was talking about with some of these disease modifying medications, then now we start to open up the options for management in some of these cases. So I would say those are probably the two things that I'm most excited about, is just the awareness and the education, and then some of that research that's being done of new management strategies, new treatments, new detection, that's only going to help down the road.
Yeah, so true. So thank you both for sharing all that expertise with us tonight. Not surprisingly, we have lots of questions, so we'll see how many we can get through right now. The first question a few people have brought up, which I think is important, maybe Trevor, I'll ask you first. All of the physical activity and exercise things that we've just been discussing, would they be relevant to somebody with osteoarthritis alone, or somebody with an inflammatory form of arthritis as well? Could you comment on that for a second?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of the principles we talked about apply to many, if not all the types of arthritis. Um, where the differences come in, inflammatory versus say osteoarthritis, is we might just have to change our parameters a bit and also consider where we're at as far as whether we're in a flare up or whether we're in a remission stage, because those things will impact it. So with an inflammatory arthritis, for example, if we're going through a flare up, we're probably going to back off on some of the strengthening exercises, but pay a little bit more attention to the mobility exercises to try to at least maintain the mobility that we have. The principles are the same though, as far as that 0 out of 10 pain scale is to know when we're doing too much and making sure that we're keeping that pain within uh, reasonable levels. The one thing I didn't talk about was pain after activity. So with osteoarthritis, we tend to be able to, if you want to say, get away with a little bit more. Where if we do get a bit of pain with activity, as long as it goes back to that baseline within a couple hours, then we're generally on the right track. With some of the more inflammatory conditions, we like to see it come back a little bit quicker. So we want to try to get that back to a baseline probably within an hour or so. Because if it gets lasting too long, then potentially signs that we've created a little bit more inflammation in there, which is going to be a little bit more delayed recovery. So, as far as the amount, the 150 minutes a week, that applies across the board. It's more, what types of activity are we going to do, especially if we are going through a flare up, then how do we modify it? Is it less repetition? Is it more range of motion instead of strength? Is it more balance? Those would be the things where the differences would come in.
Actually, you just touched on another question, so I'm going to follow with you, and then Claire, I'll come to you in a second. But you talked about pain after activity. The question here was about what if you have no pain during the activity and do afterwards? Is that also a sign that maybe you're doing too much, or what would your thoughts be around that?
Not necessarily. Again, the parameters we just talked about would apply there. So usually the delayed pain is an inflammatory pain. I mean, there is a few exceptions, but usually pain that comes on a few hours later, or particularly the next day, is a sign that there's a bit of an inflammatory process, um, which again isn't necessarily anything to be scared of or to avoid, as long as it's reasonable. So, if it's calming down within a few hours, we can certainly manage that. Um, if we're starting to find that a joint is getting red or hot or swollen, then absolutely, then we did too much. And now we've got to start to back off. And again, we don't necessarily want to stop, but we do need to modify and find a way that we can move that joint without creating those signs of irritation, the redness, the heat, the swelling, those things that we can actually see and feel. We want those things to go down fairly quickly. But if we're getting those ones, then yeah, we definitely need to do a bit of modification with it.
Okay,
And
that's
if
great. Yeah,
I'm
please.
to add a little bit in there too, is I think it's helpful differentiating between joint pain and muscle pain. Um, because when we're exercising and we're talking about these pain rules, we're really talking a lot about the pain that we're experiencing in our joints, and knowing, especially if we're doing strengthening exercises, we might feel a bit of soreness in our muscles the next day, and that can still be quite appropriate to show that um, that muscle pain that we experience after exercising can be expected and can be okay.
That's a really good point.
That's great. So Claire, you did mention yoga briefly, but there've been a lot of questions in the Q&A about that. So really, how does that fit in terms of recommended, not recommended? Does it help with strength, balance, chair yoga, frequency? If you could just elaborate a little bit more on any of those, I'm sure people would be really grateful.
Absolutely. So I will start by saying there are many different types of yoga that exist out there. Uh, there are certainly those power yoga classes that are quite intense, and there are slower yin classes, I think they're called, and chair yoga. So you can, in some ways, find the type of yoga that works for you. But broadly, when we're thinking of those four categories of exercise that Trevor talked about, so that strengthening, flexibility, cardio, and balance, I think about yoga really touching on flexibility. And if it's a standing practice, it can work quite well on balance. and it can have an element of strengthening depending on the types of postures that you're going through. I don't tend to find much of a cardiovascular benefit unless it's one of those really high intensive types of yoga exercise classes. So it can be beneficial, and you really need to think about if there are modifications you might need to make depending on areas of the joint that are of areas of the body that bother you. So for some people, if it is the hips and knees that are really bothering them to get into certain positions on a mat, then maybe a chair yoga or more of a standing yoga practice could be more beneficial. If it is somebody who is having arthritis in the hands and putting that pressure directly into the mat is bothering their hands, uh, we think about adding a bit more padding to those areas. So that could be folding up your mat a couple of times and offloading your hands just off the mat so you have some pressure under the heels of your hands. There are even little paddings called yoga jellies that you might see. They're little round discs that you can put underneath pressure points. So you could put it underneath the heels of your hands or underneath your knees if you find that direct pressure into the floor is causing you some pain. Um, so all that to say, yoga can be beneficial for many different reasons. It's finding the right one for you and then modifying as you feel you need to.
Okay. Trevor, maybe I'll ask you this. Are there any specific physical activity guidelines based on people's age and weight?
Age for sure. See, I referred to the 24-hour movement guidelines. They're available online. It's through CSEP, so CSEP, the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiologists. They have some really good age-based movement guidelines. Um, when with weight, there is guidelines. They're a little trickier to find because weight is harder to define. Some groups will use body mass index. Other groups will use body composition or fat percentage, and so it's the weight stuff gets a little bit tricky. But I think if you're following the 24-hour movement guidelines, those are great because they'll talk about activity, and what I like about them is that they also refer to sleep, kind of recommended amount of sleep in a day, um, as well as they talk about sedentary time. So what's an acceptable amount of time to be doing nothing? And within that, they give some guidelines too as far as recreational screen use. So, tablets, phones, television, these sorts of things. So they include some recommendations with that as well. And so I like that they've included that with the movement guidelines because we can't move all day. There's going to be times where we do need to be sedentary. And so they help give some guidelines of what should I shoot for as far as um, how much in a period of a day should I not be moving?
Claire, you did mention some strategies to sort of protect your hands when you're doing different things. Question here though, what if you have pain in your hands and arthritis in your hands? Are there specific exercises or movements that you would recommend for people?
Oh, absolutely. And uh, I'll give a plug. There's a YouTube video on our website with some specific hand exercises for arthritis. Um, and really, what we're looking at is often with arthritis, we might have a decreased range of motion or decreased flexibility in some of those joints in the fingers. And so oftentimes that's where I look at starting off first is seeing if we can create a bit of movement to decrease some stiffness in those joints and those fingers. So that can be something as simple as making a fist and opening your hand back up again to work all of those joints together. But one particular motion that is challenging for a lot of people because we don't do it in our day to day is if we don't bend the joints where our fingers connect to our hands and try to just tuck the tips of the fingers towards the palm of the hand. I can't think of many activities that make us do that in our day. And so I often find that people lose that tuck range of motion as they're working about in their day. So that's a nice motion to practice because it helps us to make a good tight fist that allows us to grasp onto things with greater ease. And so those might be some that I'd look at to see if we can start with that flexibility and pliability within the joints and the hands.
What about maybe Trevor? I'll ask you this first, and Claire, feel free to chime in. But what if you particularly have osteoarthritis in your knee? So it makes some of the exercises that we've talked about a bit tricky. What would you recommend for people?
So the knee is certainly one of the most common areas affected by osteoarthritis in particular. There is a specific exercise and education program out there called the GLAD program. So the GLAD program is designed for hip and knee osteoarthritis, and there's different centers across the country that run that program. It's usually a 6-week program. GLAD has some really good resources on their website as well. In general, with the exercises for the knee, we look for ones that are repetitive, that are low impact, where we can still simulate some movement through the knee. So one example of one of the GLAD exercises is sitting in a chair with an elastic resistance band, like what Claire was talking about, tied to the chair, and then it's hooked around your ankle, and you're straightening your knee and bending your knee. And so you're using those muscles on the front of your thigh to strengthen around that knee. And we know that quadricep strength is really important for knee osteoarthritis. So that's an example of an exercise where we don't have to stand. We can actually sit while we do it, but we can still strengthen. Like Claire said, those resistance bands are very affordable. They're easy to use. And so that's kind of one example of a nice exercise we can use to work some of that knee strength. Even getting up and down out of a chair requires a fair bit of strength in the legs and can be helpful for knees. So again, that's one of the exercises we use in the GLAD program, is getting up and down out of a chair. So, those are some to start with. Specifics, it's probably worth checking in with a healthcare professional to get some specific ones, as far as the mobility and or the strength. But the GLAD program is definitely a good place to start, because that's what it's designed for.
I'll add in as well. So generally, we're looking for land-based exercises like what Trevor's talking about. So these exercises that are done that require some of that loading through a joint, those seem to be best for joints in the hip and the knee. But if you're really having a hard time doing those land-based exercises, you might consider aquatic exercises or exercises in the water. I know some people will get into the water and just practice walking back and forth and using the resistance of their arms as they're swinging for that additional resistance. And that make people feel a bit more comfortable, gain a bit of muscle strength so that they feel they can get into more of those land-based exercises too.
So, Claire, we have somebody here that really enjoys trail walking and is looking for advice about what kind of assistive devices would be helpful for them.
Ooh, okay. So trail walking, I mean, and we can think at multiple different times of year, but I'm going to say footwear is going to be your best friend to start off with. So starting from the ground up, knowing when we're walking on trails, we're walking on uneven surfaces. And so you want those shoes to be quite sturdy for you and to have good traction as you're walking. If it's a boot or if it's a hiking boot, you would might be looking for more of that ankle support as well. When we're walking on those uneven surfaces, that gives us that additional stability through the ankle and then working our way back upwards. So a good supportive hiking boot or outdoor boot is great. But I look at things like trekking poles or hiking poles as that other beneficial tool to keep that stability on those uneven surfaces. I like to use them when I'm out trail hiking because it takes off some pressure if I have my backpack on me, and it gives it a bit more stability on those sometimes rocky trails. So walking poles are a great option, a good supportive boot. And then if it is something like a knee that's bothering you, you could consider wearing a knee brace during that hike for a little bit of extra support and security while you're out hiking.
Great tips there, Claire. Thank you. Trevor, what about time of day for physical activity and exercise? Any recommendations around that?
Yeah, for sure. It'll vary a little bit based on what type of arthritis that you're dealing with. as a general rule, and again, particularly with osteoarthritis, because we talk about that a lot, generally first thing in the morning is not the greatest, because we know sort of that, with osteoarthritis, that first half hour, an hour, or if it's more of a rheumatoid condition, sometimes that first couple hours, we tend to be pretty stiff and can be fairly painful in the morning. So, we might do a bit of range of motion type exercise during that time, but, doing some strengthening is probably not the greatest at that time. We like Claire talked about, move to move kind of idea. So as once you get warmed up, whether you get up and you have a warm shower, a warm bath, or you get up moving around the house or moving around the yard a bit, that helps get that body lubricated and warmed up, much like warming the car up in the winter. So then it's going to be better prepared to do some of these exercises. So, it can be within that first couple hours of getting up in the morning. But, as a general rule, we'll recommend, not first thing in the morning. And then from then, it essentially becomes a preference, depending on your day as to what's going to be the best consistent time of day that you're able to do it. If it is an arthritic knee, for example, it might get pretty sore by the end of the day if you're on your feet all day. So then you may want to exercise a little earlier in the day. So kind of knowing your own body, what times of day do you normally get the most sore, and then maybe trying to stay away from those times of day so that you can get a little more effective exercise out of it.
So I would love to get both of your thoughts on this last question. It's a tricky one. Maybe Claire, I'll start with you. How do we make the time and find the motivation to do all of the good things that you've just described?
Oh, it is a great question because there's so many different things we can be doing during our day to day that and our schedules can be really full. So I would start off with thinking about what is that main motivation for why we want to stay active, and keeping that in our mind. That could be writing it down, or telling somebody of what your plan is, and why you want to be active. That can help with building that momentum, building that accountability to staying active. But I'd really say start small. It doesn't need to be going to the gym for an hour. It doesn't need to be going for a big long walk. Even start with some of that physical activity. And that could be things like parking a little bit further away so you get a bit more walking to get into the store. It could be choosing to take the stairs rather than the elevator a couple of times to see if you can increase some more physical activity there. And starting small and building up from there.
Great. What about you, Trevor?
Yeah, I'd follow up on that, and some stuff Claire talked about earlier of, really, it doesn't take having to set aside time in the day necessarily to do it. If you can work it into things you're already doing during the day, then that makes such a difference. And Claire talked about doing some of the heel raises where you're going up and down on your toes while you brush your teeth. Sometimes I'll have people practice balance while they're brushing their teeth. Those sorts of things. When you're doing dishes, you can do some hand exercises in the nice warm water as you're doing dishes. And so, that often works really well, where you can kind of incorporate it into things that you're already doing during the day, rather than trying to set aside that half an hour or an hour, which is likely going to be different day to day. And so that's when it sometimes gets hard with the consistency in creating a habit, is when your daily routine changes, because no 2 days are the same. And so that idea of working it in, I think Claire made mention of the one lady who every time she'd get up out of a chair, she would sit down and stand up 3 times, just each time that she got out of the chair. So, little things like that are often a good place to start. And then, as you get comfortable and consistent, then we can probably start to look at some dedicated times during the day or every couple of days that we have like a set exercise routine.
Well, Trevor and Claire, thank you so much again for joining us today. We are so grateful. We'd like to take just a moment to get the audience's feedback on today's presentation. So for those of you who are live on Zoom, you should see a poll question pop up on your screen with some answer options. So obviously click on the option that reflects your thoughts. We'll also be sending out an evaluation form when we email the recording of the slides. So if you weren't able to access the poll directly, you'll have the opportunity to give feedback then. We really do use all of this survey feedback to shape our Arthritis Talks webinars, so we value your input. So thank you so much in advance. And finally, the recent postal strike deeply affected Arthritis Society Canada and many other charities occurring during our most critical fundraising period. So while so many of our supporters did step up by donating online digitally, we still fell short of our fundraising goals. So we, along with all charities across the country, are waiting on more information from Canada Revenue Agency around a proposed tax receipt deadline extension, and we'll certainly keep you informed as we get more details about that. But as you know, donations do power everything that we do. They allow us to fund critical research. They enable us to do things like host these Arthritis Talks and support people living with arthritis all across Canada. So the current shortfall threatens our ability to sustain some of those essential programs, and I do urge you, if you can, help us by donating at arthritis.ca/donate. You can really make a difference, and remember, any amount really does help. So once again, we are so grateful to Pfizer and our other partners for their financial support of this event, and we do hope to see you at our next Arthritis Talks, focused on arthritis medications on March the 5th. We'll send more information about that shortly and how to register. So this does conclude tonight's Arthritis Talks. On behalf of all of us, thank you so much for joining us, and as always, please stay well.